céad maigad tá mé ansonna a bheith an seo, agus seo an plán a bhí a gin riú anál go mé ócaidí mar seo in Aonach Mhacha. Mar a deir Virginia Dominic were attempting to put the Ard in Ardmhacha up here. It's like a little piece of Manhattan in the shambles on a night like this. So, Gregory Knipe, Professor Gregory Knipe, is the man of the moment, and we're all gathered here to talk about his wonderful book, albeit belatedly, because many of you got your copy before Christmas, as I did. I haven't got my copy signed yet, but we'll put that to the right. So, Siegi Shear, Ligigi Were Skiste, agus Ní Glochi sé seo ach couple of hours. It should only take an hour and 3/4, what I have to say, so just relax. Go with the flow. The Fourth Northerners and the Irish Revolution by Professor Gregory Knipe here, and published by Litter Press, is a comprehensive and accurate survey of the extent and variety of operations and actions a century ago in the territory allotted to a feared and revered division under Frank Aiken. The division consisted of 3,627 volunteers. It was subdivided into 3 brigades, which were North Louth, Newry and Armagh here. At a more local level, the Fourth Northerners were organised into companies and battalions. They were organised and marshalled to the nth degree. And in this book, we have a fascinating and authentic story of our own people. Inspirational and yet often sad too. The presentation of Professor Knipe's material is equally well organised and subdivided forensically for us, mounting to what is an intelligent synthesis of a huge quantity of material. As well as being highly structured, the content is clear and cogent. Both Litter Press and Gregory here beside us is to be congratulated for the obvious rigour in the production of this handsome and meticulously created volume. Included are 58 illustrations of varying forms with hitherto unseen photographs from family collections. These lend an extra validity to the overall approach. And maybe it is only when we actually look at the faces in these photographs and read their surnames and their townlands and their street names, when those black and white or monochrome eyes peer back at us from history, it is then that we think of the human aspect of what happened and ponder a while on their relatives and loved ones, some of whom join us here tonight. We realise, when we see these people in the photographs, more completely that this turbulent period left a legacy which endures a century later. The context which Gregory has reassembled for us was multi-layered with many contours and demands the level of scholarly detail that this work certainly displays. There is, as we all know, in what we can see unfolding elsewhere on the globe, there is a price to be paid for war, and paid most dearly by victims, loved ones, but also, which is not often realised, by combatants. We know equally that circumstances do occur when ordinary right-thinking men and women are compelled to make a stand for their beliefs, for liberty, for their country. It is, of course, ironic that the primary reason England gave for going to war just a few short years before the events discussed in this book, that is, to protect the freedom of small nations, is the very antithesis of what they were actually inflicting on our people here in Ireland, their first colony. The trauma of colonisation, which all this goes back to, or let's call it violent conquest, is transgenerational and must ultimately be dealt with wherever it has been inflicted, for what we know now is that what is repressed returns and manifests in bizarre forms such as shame, self-loathing, hyper-deference to authority, of which we've had a lot in this country, and a dislike of one's own culture, such as the Irish language. This book deals with the wounds of the past in this area. Wounds inflicted and endured on all sides. Professor Knipe handles his material dispassionately, and his authoritative volume is in many ways a literary equivalent to a retrospective truth commission for the area and the era in question. The extent of the suffering endured by many, as chronicled in this book, is shocking and horrifying. How must Michael Smith of Beleg have felt when he awoke on Christmas Eve in 1919 to find those dark shadows of the B specials in his own bedroom? And did he believe that he could outrun the rifles of this rogue regiment? For alas, he could not, and was gunned down dead like a fox. Or did Peter Mackin of Aonach expect to die that very same Christmas Eve when he raced from the specials on what turned out to be anything but a silent night or a holy night? Nationalists or Catholics were not the only people to suffer in our area, of course, as we have already indicated. What must the terror have been like for the men and the women and the children at Altnavay when, sadly, cruel and murderous revenge paid them a black and bloody visit on the 16th, running into the 17th of June 1922. It came to them in a form of a 30-strong group of Irish volunteers who came to carry out what became known as the Altnavay slaughter. It was a dark and evil episode in our history which we must face up to if we are going to fully heal the wounds of the past. 6 innocent Protestants were mercilessly killed on that midsummer's night a century ago. Bloodshed is no cleansing or sanctifying thing, as Padraig Pearse, the poet, claimed it was. His claim he made before he had experienced personally the horror of war himself. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is in no way to deny his subsequent bravery and fearlessness, or his many other intellectual attributes. And as much as bloodshed and war is to be resisted and avoided, if at all possible, to this very day, so too is the subjugation of native peoples and oppression in its many guises here in Ireland and across the globe. For what, if not this, was the War of Independence and other such strikes against colonial powers all about? One of the Fourth Northerners' most notable successes, from their perspective of course, was the attack on King George's 5th Army, the 10th Hussars, returning from Dublin by train from opening the Stormont Parliament on the 7th of June 1920 at Adavoyle. They did this attack by removing the train tracks, and 3 soldiers were killed, along with 52 horses and 30 soldiers injured. In reprisal, the forces lashed out, killing 3 local men who happened to be in the area, we are told in this book. To change the tone a little bit, my father told me as a boy that one could obtain a ticket to New York from Adavoyle train station. And I asked others, could this possibly be true, right up until the 1930s, and they said, yes, quite possibly. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a joining up of the dots in terms of transport that we are sadly lacking in many respects. The roles of key players are addressed, such as Bulmer Hobson, Ernie O'Malley, Michael Collins, and Frank Aiken, the main leader of the Fourth Northerners, gunman turned statesman and political luminary. And also, as it happens, a former pupil of the Abbey Grammar in Newry, as was I. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can sort of see how he developed his dogged resilience and perseverance under continual attack. And I might point out, he also attended St. Coleman's College. He was a physically imposing man. And he went on to be a political colossus. From expert guerrilla war fighter, he transformed himself into an architect of global human rights. But it seems he was no supporter of one Charles J. Haughey. He held many ministerial portfolios, even late into life. Ultimately, it would be Frank Aiken who ordered the volunteers to dump arms and return home. In our own family story, my own family story, and many of your family stories are in this wonderful volume, Frank Aiken stayed with my grandfather's auntie, Minnie Kearney, in Camloch. Now, when I was reading this book, a question arose in my mind, and that question may well have arisen in your minds, or may well arise in your minds when you read this book, and that is simply, what would I have done had I been alive at this time? Would I have been a volunteer like my granny's brothers? Peter and John McParland of Carrick na Gavna, or a carrier of dispatches by bicycle, as was my then young granny, Elizabeth McParland? Or would I have been like the many others, trying to keep bread on the table and a fire in the hearth, and hoping that it would all end soon and that Ireland would finally be at peace and free from the yoke of perfidious Albion? Now, one aspect which comes across very powerfully in Gregory Knipe's research is the relentless nature of operations and the necessity for volunteers and leaders to multitask on a vast array of missions on land, across rivers, and even at sea, in mountains also, and in both urban and rural settings. The context which we get in this wonderful book is all important, and it is provided in this volume in detail and with authenticity. We are all indebted to Professor Gregory Knipe for producing an exact chronological account of this revolutionary period, of the era and the events as they relate to the 4th Northern Division in particular. What Gregory Knipe treats of in this book is the story of our aunts, of our uncles, of our granddads and our grannies and their neighbours and their friends. To understand ourselves, we must understand the story of our forebears. For their story is in fact our story, and we should always remember that we are not so much spinning our stories, but being spun by those stories. Guracéad Maigah.